Hey, welcome to the CMO Whisper Show. I'm your host, Steve Olensky. Part marketing practitioner, part ad agency veteran, part journalist. I was a writer for Forbes for 10 years. I've had so many insightful conversations over the years with business leaders, to athletes, to celebrities, to, of course, CMOs. The only difference now is instead of sharing those insights through written form, I'm doing it this way. My guest today is Christopher Wallace. Christopher spends his days helping companies close one of the biggest gaps in business, the space between what gets said in the boardroom and what actually happens in front of the customer. He's the president of InnerView, where he works closely with sales organizations to make sure their go-to-market strategies don't just live in slide decks, but actually show up in the moments that matter most, aka when customers are making buying decisions. Under his leadership, InnerView has helped companies drive meaningful improvements in revenue performance and customer satisfaction across millions of frontline interactions. Christopher is also an adjunct marketing professor at Villanova University, and his insights have been featured in the following: Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and Ad Age, to name just a few. He's a frequent keynote speaker, panel moderator, and podcast guest, appearing on more than 70 business shows. And finally, he lives just outside Philly, like yours truly, with his family, where you'll likely find him hiking, kayaking, attempting to prove his golf game. I love the use of the word attempting, or talking about what might be his most unique passion, drumroll, backpacks. Yes, you heard that right, backpacks. Christopher, welcome to the CMO Whisperer podcast.
Steve, thank you so much for having me. This is a long time coming. I've wanted to be on this show for a long time, so I appreciate you having me on.
Listen, I'm a big fan of your work. I'm so glad we got connected. And as they say, any Philly guy, right, I'm in.
Right, exactly. Got to stick together, us Philly people.
I kind of want to talk about backpacks, and we'll get to that later if we have time, because I'm sure it's quite a great story. But I'm sure the customers, listen to me saying customers, the listeners, I want to hear about what your thoughts on other topics. So let's start with translating marketing strategy for sales execution. Okay. One of the biggest disconnects inside companies is the gap between what gets said in those boardrooms and actually happens in front of the customer. First question is, why does that gap exist in the first place?
There's a lot of reasons why. I think that the silos that exist inside a lot of organizations, now we'll talk about companies of various sizes, but in a lot of organizations, what marketing is tasked with doing and what sales is tasked with doing, really, it's just too far apart, right? They're not connected in terms of how they're goaled. The left hand's not talking to the right hand, so to speak. And I think what happens is you have one group that is really geared toward, building the brand and or driving demand, right? Being the marketing organization. And then the sales team's execution looks very different from what the marketing organization is trying to do. So I would say the biggest reason the gap exists is those two groups operate independently from each other. They're siloed. They're trying to accomplish different things. And for whatever reason, most organizations aren't great at just driving cohesion between them, making sure that they're talking and really linking them. And the age-old question is, should sales and marketing live under one organization inside companies? And my answer to that would be yes.
Oh, wow. I can hear the collective, oh no, amongst some of my listeners. And I'm sure you face that literally in face-to-face conversations with people in sales or marketing. No, they need to be separated.
Yeah,
so
it depends on who you talk to.
Why? Let me play devil's advocate. Why? Why should they be together?
You're talking about the strategy and the execution. One's a strategy arm, one's an execution arm, right? You really are. And I think in a lot of what I'm going to talk about really focuses on, call it the B2C or the B2B2C world. That's really where my team and I have our expertise. But I think that I'll give you a story about a CMO that's a friend of mine. Actually, also lives here locally. Probably had him on the show. He told me a story. He was in the gaming business. He was in the casino business. And he told me a story about when he took over marketing, he demanded that all of at the time they were called these guest advocates or guest concierges, sort of the people that cater to the high rollers and things like that. And he demanded that team be moved under him. And he had a separate training team that sat inside the marketing organization that really was working to make sure that anything they developed in terms of, he was developing loyalty strategies, but anything they were doing from a loyalty perspective was really turned into a new playbook, kind of an evolving playbook for these guest concierges. And, by doing so, he was able to really control, what I'm telling the customer on one hand and what they're hearing when they stand in front of one of my people, because, right, that's the disconnect that we see all the time. So I think that, when we look at, whether or not you have sales and marketing under one organization, the person setting the strategy, having an understanding of how it's going to get executed at that point of transaction, I think you can make a strong case that having those as closely connected as possible is going to drive better results. It's going to drive better ROI on your marketing spend.
Okay, I'm still playing devil's advocate, or maybe not with this next question, but clearly there's egos involved.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Well, I think that there are egos involved now, and I'm not saying that every organization needs to change their structure today, right? I do think that over time, I think that sales and marketing leaders have recognized more and more that they need to work more closely together. But when you go back to the ego piece, I think that to me it just comes down to dollars and cents, right? How can the company operate as efficiently as possible, right? And if you have the expenditures coming from the market, and again, depending on the organization, but if the money being spent on the marketing side of the house is really what's driving the demand, if that's driving the phone calls, the foot traffic, however your demand is coming in, I really think that there's a big efficiency play. And listen, if I'm a sales leader and I've got an ego, at the end of the day, don't I want to capture as much of that demand as I possibly can? Now, where I really think it gets tricky, Steve, I think the equation gets really tricky if the company's investment in sales is substantially greater than their investment in marketing. Mm-hmm. That's where I think it gets really, really tricky. That's where I think some of your listeners would say, well, we're a sales-led organization. Marketing sort of supports what sales is doing. And I think in that instance, it can be tricky because I don't know that salespeople providing direction to marketers is necessarily the best thing. I think that the strategy piece really has to be on lockdown. So I do think that's where it really gets tricky, is if you flip that coin over and marketing is really kind of the smaller and call it less resourced part of the organization, then it gets really tricky.
Is it too simplistic? And you tell me if it is. Is it too simplistic to think that alignment would go a lot smoother if there was a better understanding or a coming together of the whole attribution part of this? Meaning, no, sales wants credit. No, marketing wants credit. But if we just roll it together, would that help?
So I think it goes back to when I talked about the goals, right? The goals in years gone by, it was, when social media really started to explode, it was clicks and likes and reshares and things like that. Now, I think over the last, 6-8 years, I think that the marketing side of the house has really gotten tighter in terms of making sure that they're measured in actual tangible business results, right? Real business impact. I don't think it's as simple as saying, yes, we're all going to be under one roof and we're going to be focused on kind of one set of metrics. But I do think the attribution piece is key. I think that the attribution shouldn't be hard. Marketing should have one set. It should flow all the way through. Marketing is guiding one portion of the journey and sales is picking up another portion of the journey. The metrics that drive the first end of the funnel versus the metrics that are going to deliver that you're going to track on the back end of the funnel, the bottom part of the funnel, really should be different. And it should be clear how, if you're doing well with these, if you're not delivering the results that you want, you should be able to look at the bottom of the funnel. If marketing's doing their job, it should be clear to look at the bottom of the funnel and say, hey, listen, we're not converting it where we need to convert. Why? What's going wrong? And a lot of times that comes down to things like messaging and just pure execution and following processes and good customer experience habits and things like that. But I think the metrics should be on a continuum and really look at the funnel and look at the buyer journey, as opposed to trying to be sort of collapsed together. I don't know that would necessarily help.
I know, and I simplified it, of course, for brevity's sake here, but I can just see people going, who are not in sales and marketing, going, look, just roll it all together. But it's not that simple. But we'll table that. Maybe if we do a part 2, we can dive deeper into that whole dynamic. I want to move to consumer buying habit. Now, this is not breaking news, but consumers today have more information and more choices than ever before. And we'll be saying that a year from now, and that'll never end. But right now, from what you're seeing, looking backwards, how have buying behaviors really changed in the last, say, 5 to 10 years?
If we look at the rise of digital information for the consumer, I think we all know what happened was it went from the salesperson had the information, right? Think about buying a car 25 years ago, 20 years ago. The salesperson had the information. They were protecting the information, and the customer was trying to gather as they went. They went there because that was kind of the single source of truth, whether it was product info or pricing and financing and things like that. So the internet obviously made it a lot easier for people to access that. It gave them all the information that they needed, but they got to the point where they had a lot of information. They felt empowered, and then the information kept growing and growing and growing, and the choices kept growing and growing and growing. And what we have seen is it went from empowered customer to overwhelmed customer. Okay, so over the last, you say, 5 to 7 years, 6 or 8 years, whatever, what we've seen is that the average consumer, and we have research to back this up, and we've got lots of anecdotes from clients to back this up, but the average consumer starts their typical buying process overwhelmed. I read a slide deck from one of our clients one time. The first page of the slide deck said, our customer starts their buying journey confused, frustrated, and overwhelmed. Confused, frustrated, and overwhelmed. And I think that what you find is consumers, the information reaches a point of saturation where they say, okay, I've got more than I need. And now I don't know what to select. I've got so much info, so many choices. Sorting it out is a real challenge for me.
Yeah. And that then becomes, it just snowballs, right?
Well, it's yes, because so think about, I love conversation or a anecdote from a book I read last year called Sales Pitch by a woman, an author named April Dunford. Okay. And in the book, she talks about buying a toilet. Okay. Now, April Dunford's, her expertise is really in software and like positioning software tools and things like that. So she's not really focused on like home improvement purchases. That's our world, right? Those are the things we know. But I heard her describe her experience of buying a toilet. And it's one of those things where if you don't get the right help, she's got all the information she needs. Like how many gallons per minute it flushes and so on and so forth. Like she can access all that, but really understanding how all that information boils down to what toilet she actually should put in her home is a very nuanced thing. And if you don't get the guidance you need early on in the process, when you say it snowballs, you get one little piece of wrong information or somebody guides you in the wrong direction. Well, you could get stuck down that going down that rabbit hole for a long time, and you're not necessarily getting closer to what you need to make a purchase. So, what we see is the information is leading to a lack of confidence on the buyer side. And that's a challenge, right? That organizations need to meet that challenge and say, okay, we've got to empower confident purchases. And I don't think more information is the answer. I think better organized information is the answer. It's part of the answer.
I was going to say it's part of it. It's a big part, but it's just a part of it.
Yeah.
There's no shortage. I'm laughing because if I see one more company say this term, but so many companies say they're customer centric, air quotes. In reality, what are most organizations still getting wrong about that, and how people make actually make buying decisions?
Okay, so I'm going to tell you my favorite stat. So on my first day, whenever I teach my class at Villanova, MBA level class, the first thing I teach the students on day one is I have them read a Wall Street Journal article. It's from 2024.
Okay.
And the article talks about how, I think, if I'm going to get the stat right, 91%, okay, 91% of CEOs say they are a customer-led organization. They're a customer-first organization, okay? 58% of the CMOs say that their company is customer first. Okay, so think about that. You've got a 33%, and I think I'm within a couple percentage points on those stats, but you're talking about 33% gap between what the CEO says and what the CMO says in terms of the perception of whether or not they're customer-led organizations or if they're customer-first organizations. So my personal belief is customer-centric has just become a buzz phrase, when in reality, there are systems and tools and entire operating models designed around being a customer-first organization. And they're not always, that doesn't always mean they're going to be the most efficient organization. It doesn't mean they're always going to be the fastest organization, but they're typically going to be the highest margin organizations. They're going to be the most beloved organizations. But it's not easy. You can't just say it and put it on your website and be customer centric. You really have to put all the mechanisms in place to empower your people and empower the right decision making. Everything from pricing to product design to service offerings, all those things really need to be thought through with the right mechanisms in place to make sure it's all pointing toward value to the customer.
By the way, put that on a plaque somewhere, please, what Christopher just said, because it's really that straightforward and that simple. And talk about for part 2, I could have my own discussion on that with so many people about how this is just so overblown. That's why I preface this by saying, if I see one more company say they're customer centric, I'm going to blank, because it drives you crazy. And to me, it falls under the overarching belief that I have that so many companies literally underestimate the knowledge and the savviness that consumers have. They all know. Yeah. We're all consumers. We know you're trying to sell us something. We get that.
Well, so, and this is a piece I'm really passionate about, Steve. And this is going to be, from a thought leadership perspective, my writing, my videos and things like that. The key theme that I'm on right now is I really think that organizations, the way they approach a sales conversation, the way they approach that buying journey is really outdated. I think it's 10 to 15 years, if not more, outdated, where they still think it's some sort of a game, some sort of a sparring exercise with a customer. And the reality is the average consumer does not have the time to waste, right? I've often said that I want to retire the phrase tire kickers. You still hear retail owners or sales managers use the phrase, oh, well, if a tire kicker comes in, it's like tire kicker, right? This idea that people have this spare time to come in and price shop you against 5 other retail stores it's completely misguided. And I think it misguides, your salespeople and your frontline teams.
Archaic.
It's archaic, but there's still so many people that are entrenched in this way of thinking. And the way we, in the programs that we do with our clients, we say they are here to buy. You should assume every single customer is here to buy, and you should assume your close rate is going to be 100%. Not because it is going to be 100%, but you need to treat every single customer and every single lead as a qualified buyer. If you don't if you don't approach every single conversation, every single customer as if they are there to make a purchase during that interaction, right? Or at least in a subsequent interaction, then you're going to turn customers away, because if they don't feel like you're serious about doing business with them, they will begrudgingly go do business with somebody else. They do not want to go store to store to store or call around, or the data all supports that if they don't have to, they don't want to. So This idea that, people are price shopping, they can just pull it up on their phone and have it instantaneously. Be willing to defend the value of what you charge against your competition, as opposed to like being afraid that they're going to price shop you. So this idea that the customer's in it for some sort of a game is completely outdated thinking. They are all there to buy. And if you assume otherwise, you're making a mistake.
Does everything you just say apply to B2B as well?
I'm going to be honest and say, I don't know. I'll be, I know my limitations, Steve. Okay. I'm self-aware enough to know my limitations. My organization, we're a B2B organization ourselves. It just so happens that the services that we provide are primarily for a B2B2C or a B2C audience. Mm-hmm. I think that given the number of buyers involved in a buying decision, or number of people involved in the buying committee on the B2B side is so much greater that you may have somebody who's more on a fact-finding mission. You may have, and that's why I think, we talk about people can get the information they need. I think on the B2B side, more and better organized information for the B2B buyer, I think is the trend that I'm seeing, right? Transparency, more information up front. They're going to get it at some point. Holding things behind a walled garden or dragging people through long discovery processes before they can find out what your services, your tools cost, that type of thing. I think that is going out of fashion very, very quickly.
I agree. And I happen to think it does apply to a lot of B2B, having spent a lot of time in that world myself. But it's another part 2. This part 2 list is growing, by the way. We're going to have a really good
I was going to say, yeah.
Right?
That's a good sign.
Exactly. So I want to kind of move to driving frontline behavior change. Ooh. So companies, we all know, spend enormous amounts of time and money building strategy. But the frontline is where it either lives or dies. So why is changing frontline behavior so hard for organizations?
The first reason is because they're giving them too many things to focus on and too many things to do. Okay, I would say they're overloaded and under prioritized is probably a better way to say it. That's the primary reason, right? These folks are kind of the tip of the spear from an execution standpoint, and they're asked to sell everything, talk about everything, position everything as frequently as they possibly can. And at some point it just becomes noise and they start to tune it out. So, one of the things that, I talked to, there's a friend of mine who's been he's more of a B2B, a sales consulting guy, but he and I really, we bonded last year over this idea of clarity for salespeople. And I think when we think about behavior change, we think about driving execution at the front lines. The number of organizations that have failed to give their salespeople, customer service reps, technicians, whomever shows up in that customer conversation, who's ever at that point of customer interaction, the number of companies that fail to give them explicit direction on what they want to do and clear expectations is staggering. It's staggering. One of the first things we asked them is, well, what were they told to do? Well, they were put through a training and they were told about the product, and they're okay, but what were they told to do? Organizations leave their frontline teams to figure out how to take goals and product information and somehow turn it into great conversations and great messaging with their, with their customers. And that's the point of execution that we're failing to see. So lack of clarity. I mean, it's over prioritization is the biggest issue in terms of why frontline struggle. But to remedy that, radical clarity for your front lines, clear direction on things is the first step in driving that behavior change.
When you get called into a company that says, hey, Christopher, we want to change how our people sell or interact with customers, where do you start?
Well, the first place we start is what processes they have in place. Okay. Again, what is the fundamental, or foundational process or journey you want them to follow, right? What do you want them to walk the customer through? So what we try to understand is what is in place currently. And we take a look at that. And typically what we find in an organization is what they have is fine. It's a 5-step model. It's all the key. It's the greeting. It's the discovery. It's the presenting. Presentation of value, all those types of things. But what we often find is they're generic, they're relatively generic, and they're kind of outdated, right? They don't, a lot of them still have, I'll give you a great example. A lot of them still have things like top-down selling, right? When you go to present the offer, it's top-down. And we're like, no. Like top-down, that's like 12, 15 years ago. Customers don't buy that way. That's not how they want to be sold to, that type of thing. So we're looking to see, do they have something in place? Is it still relevant? And are they doing? I mean, those are really the three things we look at. And if an organization says, listen, we have something now, if we take a look at it and it's good, we will tell them, don't scrap it. The less change you drive to your people, the better off you are. If you're just not executing on it, we have programming that we can run for your sales leaders to re-energize them, get the defibrillator out, put the paddles on it and shock it back to life. But that's the place that we start. What is the fundamental process you want your people to follow? What's the repeatable thing you want them to do time and time again? And if it needs to be overhauled, we'll recommend an overhaul. If it's in good shape, we'll recommend kind of that refresh.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm going to use a word that gets overused a lot across the board, but that's culture, right? But in the context of sales culture, what does really a strong sales culture really look like?
So the culture, it starts with that definition. Okay, what good looks like. The number, I'll go back to the shockingly low number of companies that have very clear definition around what good looks like. If you're going to represent my company, when you're talking to a customer, here is the standard that we expect you to meet. Okay, that being current, reflecting, buyer behaviors and things like that, and being clearly defined is very rare. Okay, so that's the first thing. Where the culture, it starts to become stronger or really start to take shape is really in all the habits and touch points that they have built, the mechanisms that they build around that customer process or that customer journey to make sure that there's constant improvement, that people are coached to those behaviors, that there's really this commitment to sort of raising that standard day in and day out. That's where most organizations fall down. The culture falls apart when there's not a dedicated structure to how they support those activities. I'm going to give you an example of a company over the years that's done this extremely well. Okay, I'm going to give you one. This company we did business with for a while, TD Bank. Okay, TD Bank built an incredible culture around a clear, a whole mantra around the experience that they wanted to deliver to their customers. Then they had mechanisms built out with measurement, coaching, and support. And really, they built a culture that was, go back to your phrase from earlier, customer centric. Okay. So when you talk about this idea of culture, just saying and writing down some behaviors is one part of it, but having the support of leadership and the touch points in place where they were reviewing those things, they're measuring those things, and they're supporting their team and getting better, that's where a culture really becomes strong.
Yeah, it really does. Okay, I can't let you go, or we're going to have some fun at the end. But before we get to that, we got to talk about AI. Of course we do, right? What's the balance in your mind between technology and the human side? Where's that balance? And is it constantly shifting, I assume?
I'm going to try to be self-aware enough to say that I want to have an opinion on this, but I'm not going to, anybody that claims expertise might be overstepping a little bit. There are some experts, but what I will say is we are running at the AI conversation as it relates to frontline sales organizations. There are new tools coming out every single day. We've worked in the call center space as an example for since our inception, right? For a decade and a half. And there's been call recording in call centers for forever. But the way that the AI tools are now able to apply large language models, analyze what's happening, and give real-time feedback to agents and to salespeople to drive better sales conversations, it's incredible. It's incredible. But what we're seeing is just like with anything else. Okay, somebody said to me the other day, AI is the new CRM as it relates to sales. And I think there's potentially some truth to that. And their point was, if you do not set things up properly on the front end, if you do not train them the models the right way, if you do not have, again, clear definition of what good looks like, and it be the right definition, modern definition of it, then you've got real problems. If the tools are analyzing against the wrong behaviors and things like that, you're going to reinforce mistakes over and over again, and you're going to drive customers away. So making sure that there is real kind of human thought put into how these tools are used, and then ultimately helping your team adopt them in a comfortable way. The lack of change management being done when AI tools are introduced to sales teams is substantial, and it's no different than CRMs, right? Putting the time in to make sure that they know how the tool fits into their day, what it can do for them, and really kind of building those skills and building those habits. It's so important if you're going to get ROI out of those tools. And that's what we see companies spending a lot of money and getting nothing in return.
Exactly. Okay. Part 2 for sure. And hell, the way we're going, there could be a part 3 because there's so many other topics to talk about, including elaborating on ones we already did talk about. But looking at the time, let's end this as I always do with the random 5. These are 5 quick questions. No overthinking. Okay. Just the first thing that comes to mind. And if you're game, here we go.
Sure.
What's something you're irrationally picky about that most people would never notice? What's a pet peeve? Yeah.
Irrationally picky about that most people wouldn't notice. I used to work in the television business. Mm-hmm. I worked in the cable and telecom business. I represented cable networks. The way companies structure their shows, their hosts, that kind of thing. I had a glimpse behind the scenes on that for years, and I'm super critical of television. I'm super critical of the way networks are set up and things like that. So I would say that pet peeve is I complain about on-air talent and formatted shows all the time. So.
Okay. If someone followed you around for a week, what habit of yours would surprise them the most?
This is not something I've shared with everybody probably that often, but I meditate every day. And I think today was day 206 consecutively. 206. Today was day 206. So I call it my Control-Alt-Delete. It just kind of resets me. And I've been very fortunate to kind of learn from some people over the years, but I meditate every day. Okay.
Next question. What's something you were terrible at the first time you tried it, but kept at it anyway?
Golf's as the obvious answer, but that's too obvious. Honestly, I will say using AI tools. I will say like a skeptic and things like that. And I think that I've gotten into a good rhythm with it. So I would say adoption of AI.
Okay. Now, you clearly spend a lot of time thinking about business, right? But what's something completely operative, unrelated to work that you could talk about for an hour without preparation?
Something I could talk about for an hour without preparation. I'm a cigar enthusiast.
Okay.
So I would say cigars. I'm pretty good. I can go pretty deep.
Okay. Last question. Everyone has one, but what's a skill you wish you had, but absolutely do not?
Oh, hands down. I've said this a million times. Design. I worship graphic design. I worship people. We had a woman that worked for us for years who's the best designer I've ever worked with. And I said, she's like the ultimate business weapon. She could turn business problems into graphical solutions instantaneously. And I worship people who are good at graphic design.
Listen, I'm a big believer. It's equally important to know what you know as much as what you don't know.
Yeah, it really is such a talent. And I was last in line the day it was given out. I promise you that.
Well, I happen to have my hand raised too. You can't see me, but I do. I'm in that same line. Listen, Christopher Wallace, the time flew by. I knew it would. There is, without question, a part 2 coming. Until then, thank you, my friend.
Thank you for having me, Steve. I appreciate it.
Well, that wraps up another episode of the CMO Whisperer Show. I hope you shared this episode with your friends. And if you have not already, please subscribe to be kept up to date on all the latest episodes. And if you're so inclined, leave me a review on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you.